It was one of those hectic mornings, just like any other, when Michael left for work. I remember his suit, crisp and immaculate, not a wrinkle in sight. As he passed through the kitchen, he flashed me that smile, the one that always made my heart skip a beat even after all these years. "We'll talk when I get back," he said, his voice warm and reassuring. Then he added, "How about dinner together tonight?" Little did I know that those casual words would be the last I'd hear from him, echoing in my mind like a bittersweet melody. Michael was the epitome of success. Everyone, and I mean everyone, held him in such high regard. His business acumen was something to behold, leaving people in awe. Never in my wildest dreams did I imagine he would vanish into thin air, like a magic trick gone terribly wrong. When I finally mustered the courage to call the police, my voice betrayed me, trembling like a leaf in the wind. I kept telling myself, over and over, he'll come back safe and sound. I tried to convince myself it was just some minor trouble, nothing serious. But deep down, anxiety was gnawing at me, squeezing my chest like an iron fist. As hours turned into days, that nagging worry morphed into full-blown fear, consuming me from the inside out. Days crawled by, each one an eternity, with no word from Michael. The house, once filled with his laughter and energy, now stood silent as a tomb. His absence became more tangible with each passing moment, like a gaping hole in the fabric of our lives. Every time I gazed out the window, hope would flicker in my heart, foolishly expecting to see him strolling up the driveway. But reality, harsh and unforgiving, told a different story. Sometimes I wonder if he's out there somewhere, desperately needing my help. And here I am, feeling utterly helpless, unable to do a thing for the man I love.
Meanwhile, Michael Williams was strolling casually through the crowded streets of Metropolis. His expensive suit stood in stark contrast to the bustle around him. Those blue eyes, usually focused on the minutiae of business, were now lost in thoughts of his latest billionaire project. The city's clamor seemed to exist in a bubble around him. As he passed a newsstand, a headline about the stock market caught his eye, making him pause for a moment. Might be time to diversify investments. Never know when the winds will change, Michael muttered to himself. His voice was almost swallowed by the city noise. Suddenly, a Blackfin screeched to a halt beside him. The side door slid open with a metallic clang, and two masked men jumped out. They grabbed Michael's arms, and before he could comprehend what was happening, the startled billionaire tried to break free. His briefcase fell to the ground, important documents scattering across the asphalt. His heart raced, adrenaline coursing through his body. Struggling against his attackers, Michael shouted, "Let go. You don't know who you're dealing with. I'm Michael Williams. I can pay you anything you want." His voice mingled with the sound of car horns and the cries of shocked pedestrians. The kidnappers, efficient and determined, ignored his protests. One of them, with cold eyes visible through his mask, pressed something against Michael's back. It was unmistakably the muzzle of a gun. The other, a bulkier villain, lifted Michael off the ground and dragged him into the van. In a last desperate act, the billionaire grabbed onto the side of the door. His fingers left marks on the glossy black paint. "Someone call the police. These men are trying to kidnap me. Help!" Michael yelled, desperately scanning the faces of stunned pedestrians. Inside the van, the smell of new leather mixed with the metallic scent of fear assaulted his nostrils. Michael struggled to break free from the hands that held him firmly. His mind was racing, trying to understand the motive behind all this. Was this a common kidnapping, or revenge from a competitor, or something even more sinister? The van accelerated, plunging into the chaotic traffic of the city. Michael was thrown onto the metal floor, the impact reverberating through his body. "You don't know what you're getting into. Whoever's behind this, I can pay double, triple, whatever they want, Michael said. Despite the fear gnawing at him, he tried to keep his voice steady. The van continued its escape, weaving through traffic with spine-chilling skill. Michael continued to struggle against his captors, watching the familiar city streets flash by through the front window. After they closed the windows to prevent him from knowing their direction, the reality of his situation began to sink in. He was being taken away from everything he knew, everything he had built. For the first time in many years, the powerful billionaire Michael Williams felt completely helpless. All he could do was tremble in fear, nervously counting the seconds, hoping he would survive this ordeal. After a while, the van came to an abrupt stop, throwing Michael against the front seats. Before he could regain his composure, he was blindfolded and his hands were bound. The billionaire felt himself being dragged out of the vehicle. His feet stumbled on uneven ground. Fresh air hit his face, but the relief was short-lived. He was pushed into a building. The echo of footsteps indicated a large, empty space. After what seemed like an eternity, Michael was thrown into a cold metal chair. You don't know what a mistake you're making. When I get out of here, I'll make sure each one of you spends the rest of your life in prison, Michael growled, trying to maintain his composure. The only response he received was the sound of retreating footsteps. Michael struggled against his restraints. The metal cut into his wrists. The silence was oppressive, broken only by his ragged breathing and the occasional hum of electronic equipment. Time passed slowly, with only his increasing thirst and discomfort marking its passage. Eventually, exhausted, Michael fell into an uneasy sleep. He woke with a start, disoriented by the complete darkness. The blindfold had been removed, but the lack of light was just as disorienting. As he struggled to adjust his vision, shapes began to materialize in the darkness. The silhouettes of medical equipment surrounded him. Their standby lights blinked like watchful eyes in the darkness. What do you want from me? Who are all of you? Why are you doing this? He demanded. Suddenly, a noise to his right made Michael whip his head around. Soft footsteps approached, and he could sense a presence moving around him. His heart raced, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He tried once more to free himself, but the metal of the handcuffs bit into his flesh, rendering it futile. The footsteps stopped just behind him, and Michael held his breath, expecting the worst. Who are you? Show your face, you coward, Michael demanded, trying to keep his voice steady. Suddenly, a bright light blinded Michael momentarily. Blinking to clear the spots from his vision, he finally saw his captor. A tall man in a white coat stood before him. His face was hidden behind a surgical mask, but his eyes were cold and calculating. The man approached with a syringe in hand. Don't worry, Mr. Williams. Everything will become clear soon, the man said in a surprisingly gentle voice. Michael struggled violently. The chair creaked under his fierce movements. Get away. What are you going to do? The mysterious man ignored his protests and approached with the syringe. With quick, precise movements, the man injected the contents into Michael's arm. The effect was almost instantaneous. Michael felt his eyelids grow heavy and his vision blur. He fought to maintain consciousness, but it was a losing battle. Why? Why are you doing this? Michael mumbled. His voice was already slurred from the sedative. The last image Michael recorded before succumbing to darkness was the man walking away, retrieving something from a nearby tray. A surgical mask. Michael tried to scream, but no sound came out. His world spun, and he finally lost consciousness. He was left to the mercy of his mysterious captors and whatever fate awaited him. Consciousness returned to Michael like waves lapping at a sandy shore. Each wave brought with it a fragment of sensation. The acrid smell of cigarettes invaded his nostrils. It was this that finally woke him. A faint light filtered through faded curtains. He was lying on a narrow bed. Coarse bedding scratched against his skin. His head ached, and a sense of nausea overwhelmed him. Michael tried to sit up. Every muscle protested as he moved. Where am I? What's happening? What's going on? Michael mumbled. His voice was hoarse, unrecognizable even to his own ears. He looked around, taking in the details of the dilapidated room. Peeling wallpaper, an old TV on a rickety stand, and a window that had seen better days, covered by curtains. This was certainly not the kind of place a billionaire like Michael Williams would typically stay. His eyes caught his reflection in a mirror hanging on the opposite wall. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Michael staggered to his feet. His legs trembled under his weight. He leaned against the wall, inching his way towards the door of the room. But something caught his attention. It was the mirror. As Michael approached the door and saw his reflection, the shock felt like a punch to the gut. The face looking back at him wasn't his own. Where once there had been an oval face with aristocratic features, Michael now found a completely different visage. His once straight, sharp nose was now broader and slightly upturned. His thin lips had been replaced by a fuller, more angular mouth. His high, prominent cheekbones were now rounder, giving him a more youthful appearance. His once square, chiseled jaw was now more rounded. His thick, rich hair had been replaced by thinning gray strands, and his always clean-shaven chin now sported a slight shadow of stubble. Michael touched his face in disbelief, watching the reflection in the mirror mimic his movements. His blue eyes, the only feature that remained unchanged, stared back at him with a mixture of surprise and terror. Panic rose in his throat. No, 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 what have they done to me? This isn't real, Michael cried out. His new face contorted in an expression of horror. He stumbled backward, falling onto the bed. His mind was reeling, trying to process the impossible. Fragmented memories of his captivity, the mysterious man with the syringe, started to connect. Michael felt bile rising in his throat and barely made it to the bathroom. After suffering for a few minutes over the toilet, he crawled back to the room on still unsteady feet. Think, Michael, think. Who would do this? Why, he muttered, pressing his palms to his temples. Before he could develop any theory, a loud noise startled him. Someone was pounding on the room's door with enough force to rattle the hinges. Michael froze. His heart was pounding fiercely in his chest. The knocking sound came again, this time more insistent. We know you're in there. Open up now, or we'll break this door down, a gruff male voice shouted from the other side. Michael looked around frantically, searching for an escape route. The window seemed like the only option, but he was at least on the third floor. He was caught between a rock and a hard place. Trapped between the unknown terror behind the door and the potentially fatal drop. Who are you? What do you want from me? Michael shouted back. His new voice sounded strange to his own ears. The response came in the form of a thunderous crash as the door gave way to the intruder's violent force. Michael didn't wait to see who was coming in. In a swift motion, he ran towards the window. With trembling fingers, he wrestled with the rusty lock, finally managing to open it. The cold night air hit him, momentarily paralyzing him. He's escaping through the window. Catch him quick. He looked up to see silhouettes crowding the window of the old room. He hastened his descent. The stairs creaked dangerously under his bare feet. The cold night wind whipped his face, cruelly reminding him of his vulnerability in only a thin gown. Damn, they're too close. I've got to get off these stairs now, Michael muttered to himself. His new voice still sounded odd to his ears. Reaching the second floor level, Michael spotted a half-open window. Without a second thought, he dove through it. He rolled on the worn, dusty carpet and quickly got to his feet. Ignoring the pain in his muscles, he ran towards the dimly lit hallway. Michael heard one of the pursuers shout, "Where did he go? Search everywhere. He must be hiding somewhere on this floor." The voice echoed in the fire escape. Panic threatened to overwhelm Michael, but he forced himself to stay focused. He raced down the hallway, trying each doorknob he encountered. With every locked door, he muttered a curse. Then, miraculously, one door opened under his hand. Without hesitation, he dove into the dark room and quietly closed the door. "Good heavens," a woman's voice cried out. Michael turned to see a middle-aged woman sitting on the bed, her eyes wide with fear. Before she could scream, Michael put his finger to his lips, silently pleading for cooperation. His desperate, imploring eyes met hers in a tense moment. The only sound in the room was their heavy breathing. "Please, I mean no harm. Just let me hide for a few minutes," Michael whispered, his voice barely audible. The woman, still in shock, nodded slowly. Michael moved to the darkest corner of the room, concealing himself behind a worn armchair. His heart was pounding so fiercely he feared it might be heard from the hallway. The sounds of footsteps and voices increased, passing by the room's door and continuing forward. He must have gone downstairs. "Let's check the street," a gruff voice said, followed by the sound of several people thundering down the stairs. Michael remained motionless, counting the seconds in his head. The woman in the room didn't move either, her eyes fixed on him with a mixture of fear and curiosity. After what seemed like an eternity, the sounds of pursuit faded, indicating the men had left the hotel. "Oh, thank you. I'm so sorry for the trouble. You'll never see me again," Michael murmured to the woman. Slowly standing up, he approached the window. Cautiously peering out onto the street, he could see his pursuers dispersing, searching the area. Michael knew he needed to act quickly. "I'll wait a few more minutes, then make a break for it. I need to get somewhere safe and figure out what's going on," Michael thought. His mind was racing, planning his next move. Michael waited a few more minutes. His eyes were fixed on the street below, watching his pursuers gradually move away. Finally, deeming it safe, he turned to the woman who had been quietly observing him in the room. Her expression was a mix of fear and curiosity. "Thank you again. I can't tell you how much you've helped me. Is there a back entrance to this hotel?" Michael asked in a low, calm voice. The woman hesitated for a moment before answering. Her voice was slightly trembling. "Yes, there's a service staircase at the end of the hall on the left. It leads directly to the back alley," she replied, her voice shaking with fear. Michael nodded gratefully, checked the hallway, and quickly left the room. Following the woman's directions, he found the service stairs and descended quietly. His bare feet made almost no sound on the metal steps. Michael emerged onto a narrow, dimly lit alley. "I've got to get to the police station. It's the only place where I can explain what happened and get help," he told himself. Glancing both ways down the alley, Michael began to hurry along, sticking to the shadows and avoiding main streets. His heart was still racing, and he jumped at every sudden noise. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably just a few blocks, the front of the police station came into view. Taking a deep breath to steady his nerves, Michael entered the building. The interior was brightly lit. He blinked several times to adjust his vision after the darkness of the night. The officer sitting behind the counter eyed him suspiciously. "Can I help you?" the officer asked, his tone more accusatory than helpful. Michael approached the counter, trying to maintain his composure. "Yes, please. My name is Michael Williams. I need to report a crime. I was kidnapped, and This might sound unbelievable, but someone surgically altered my face. I don't know what's going on. I woke up in a hotel room, and there were men chasing me, but I don't know who they are, he tried to explain. He knew how ridiculous this information sounded. It was unbelievable even to him until it actually happened. The officer frowned, his expression shifting from disbelief to skepticism. Is this some kind of joke? No, it's not a joke. I know it sounds crazy, but it's the truth. I'm Michael Williams, a businessman. I was kidnapped a few days ago and woke up with a different face. I need help, Michael interrupted, his voice rising in desperation. The buzz of activity in the police station decreased, and Michael noticed several other officers looking at him with interest. One of them, a middle-aged detective with a sharp gaze, approached the counter. Calm down, sir. Come with me, and we'll talk privately, the detective said in a calm but firm voice. However, Michael could tell from the man's tone that he thought Michael was a lunatic. Michael followed the detective to an interrogation room. His heart was pounding fiercely, a mix of relief and anxiety. Perhaps now, finally, someone would listen to his story. The detective closed the door and motioned for Michael to sit. Now, let's hear this story from the beginning, the detective said, sitting across the table from him. Michael took a deep breath and began to recount the events of the past few days. The kidnapping, waking up with a new face, his escape from the hotel. But before he could finish his story, the interrogation room door suddenly opened. A second detective entered, his face registering shock as he saw Michael. Holy smokes, Smith. I couldn't believe it when I saw him from a distance. What's Andrew doing here? The newly arrived detective exclaimed to the first detective. The first detective was dumbfounded. What? What do you mean? He asked. You didn't realize? That's Andrew. He's a criminal. The detective quickly turned to Michael. His expression changed from skepticism to wariness. He hurried to the bulletin board on the wall, yanked off a wanted poster, and slapped it down on the table in front of Michael. The face on the poster was identical to the one Michael now saw in the mirror. This is Andrew. He's wanted for a major fraud scheme, Smith explained. His voice had now become stern. And you walked in here spinning a ridiculous tale about identity theft and facial surgery, he said. Michael's blood ran cold. You don't understand. I'm not this Andrew. I'm the victim here, he replied, trembling with fear. The two detectives exchanged meaningful glances. Smith made a subtle move towards the door. He was probably trying to call for backup. In a moment of sheer panic and survival instinct, Michael suddenly stood up, knocking over his chair. I'm truly sorry, but I can't be arrested for a crime I didn't commit, he said with a shaking voice. In a swift motion, Michael pushed past the two detectives, catching them off guard as he bolted from the interrogation room. The police station erupted into chaos. He dodged officers, rushing towards the exit. Stop, police, a voice shouted from behind, but Michael didn't dare look back. He burst out of the police station's main entrance, the cold night air slapping his face like a harsh wake-up call. Gunshots began to ring out behind him, and Michael ran blindly down the street, trying to shield himself as best he could. Then, he spotted an alley. His heart felt like it was about to burst out of his chest. Michael darted down the dark alley. His heart was pounding so fiercely it felt like it might jump out of his mouth. The distant sound of sirens spurred him to increase his speed. His bare feet hit the cold, rough asphalt painfully. He turned one corner, then another. He didn't know where he was actually heading, only that he needed to get as far away from the police station as possible. Think, Michael, think. Where can I go? Who would believe me? He muttered to himself, breathless. And then, like a lighthouse in the darkness, a thought occurred to his confused mind. Rachel, his wife. Yes. She knew him better than anyone. If anyone could recognize the real Michael through this strange face, it would be her. With his destination in mind, Michael began to orient himself. He slowly started to recognize the city streets he knew so well. The Williams estate was in the city's upscale residential area, several miles away. Michael knew he couldn't risk taking a taxi or public transportation. His face, or rather Andrew's face, would likely be all over the news by now. He would have to go on foot, keeping to the shadows and avoiding the security cameras scattered throughout the city. The journey was long, and Michael flinched at every passing police car. He almost came to a stop several times. Twice, he had to duck into dark alleys when pedestrians came too close. All the while, his mind was spinning with unanswered questions. How did this happen? Who did this to me, and why? Michael pondered. Fatigue and fear were battling for control of his mind. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Michael found the familiar gates of his property. The mansion stood imposingly against the night sky, its brightly lit windows like beacons of hope. Michael hesitated for a moment. He was acutely aware of his appearance, barefoot and wearing the face of a wanted man. But he had no choice. He needed help, and Rachel was his last hope. With his heart in his throat, Michael approached the intercom by the gate. His hand was shaking. He pressed the button and spoke, struggling to keep his voice steady.
I heard the intercom buzz, and my heart leapt into my throat. A voice, so familiar yet somehow different, called out to me. It was Michael, or at least someone claiming to be him, saying he needed to talk urgently. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My Michael had been missing for days, and I'd been sick with worry. I'd called the police, but they'd been no help at all. Now, here was this voice, this beacon of hope in the darkness of my despair. I responded, my voice a mixture of confusion and concern, barely recognizing it as my own. I told him how worried I'd been, how I tried everything to find him. The voice replied, insisting it was really Michael, that something terrible had happened. He begged me to let him in, promising to explain everything. I hesitated, fear and hope warring within me. Finally, I agreed to open the gate, my voice trembling with uncertainty. As the gate slowly creaked open, I felt a wave of relief wash over me, only to be quickly replaced by a new tide of tension. I watched as two security guards approached the figure, their hands on their weapons. The man raised his hands in surrender and slowly walked towards the house. I stood in the doorway, my face a mask of fear and confusion. As he got closer, I could hear him desperately trying to make me understand. He said he knew he didn't look like himself, but swore he was Michael. He claimed he'd been kidnapped, that something had been done to his face. My mind reeled, unable to process what I was seeing and hearing. I took a step back, my eyes wide with terror. The words tumbled out of my mouth before I could stop them. I told him to stay where he was, that I didn't know who he was, but he wasn't my husband. How could he do this? How could he play with our emotions when we'd been so worried? I accused him of still trying to imitate my husband's voice. My voice shook as I ordered him to leave our home immediately. As I spoke, I felt my world crumbling around me. Was this really happening? Had my desperate hope for Michael's return made me vulnerable to such a cruel trick? Or was I making a terrible mistake, turning away the very person I'd been praying would come home? The conflict tore at my heart, leaving me feeling lost and more alone than ever.
One of the security guards stepped forward. His weapon was now pointed directly at Michael's chest. The man stared at Michael, his eyes widening in recognition. The guard muttered in a voice mixed with fear and determination that this was Andrew Johnson, a wanted criminal, and warned him not to move or he'd shoot. Michael froze, feeling his world crumbling around him. He looked at Rachel, silently pleading for help, but saw only fear and disgust in her eyes. The guard's gun barrel gleamed in the porch light, a silent promise that the situation could deteriorate drastically in seconds. Michael whispered, his voice trembling with emotion, begging Rachel to look into his eyes and recognize him as her husband. Rachel hesitated, her gaze darting between Michael and the armed guard. The tension in the air was palpable. Michael knew he had only seconds to act. His wife wouldn't believe him, it must have sounded too absurd. He seized the moment of hesitation and suddenly turned, sprinting towards the back of the property. A gunshot ripped through the air, followed by Rachel's scream. She cried out in a voice mixed with fear and confusion, telling them not to shoot and to call the police to figure out what was happening. Michael focused solely on escape, not daring to look back. He leaped over the back fence with an agility he didn't know he possessed, ignoring the pain of thorns tearing at his skin. A quiet, dark suburban street stretched out before him. The distant sound of sirens spurred him to run faster, his heart pounding fiercely against his ribs. After several blocks, Michael spotted the bright sign of a 24-hour convenience store. It was risky, but he needed a place to hide and think. He slowed his pace to avoid drawing attention and entered the store. Despite being barefoot and wearing wrinkled, dirty clothes, he tried to look as normal as possible. The sleepy clerk barely glanced at Michael as he made his way to the public computer at the back of the store. With trembling fingers, he accessed his bank's website, desperately hoping to access his account and obtain funds to escape. Michael muttered as he entered his password, "Please, please. Come on, work." However, contrary to his desperate hopes, the screen displayed an error message, "Account not found." Michael tried repeatedly, each attempt failing and increasing his panic. After the fifth try, a new message appeared, "Access blocked for security reasons. Please contact your account manager." Michael felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. He wondered aloud if Rachel had said something about his disappearance, recalling that according to her, he'd been missing for at least a few days. He speculated that this might be why his account was frozen, but wondered what he should do now. As Michael stared at the screen in shock, a man entered the store. The newcomer walked towards the drink refrigerator while keeping his eyes on Michael. Suddenly, the man stopped, his eyes widening in recognition. Michael noticed this and felt his heart start to race. He tried to maintain his composure and pretend to focus on the computer, but out of the corner of his eye, he saw the man surreptitiously take out his cell phone and start dialing. Michael thought to himself, feeling fear growing in his chest, that the man had recognized him and he needed to leave immediately. Michael abruptly stood up and hurried towards the exit. The now alert clerk eyed him suspiciously. Behind him, he could hear the man speaking quietly on the phone, reporting to the police that he had just seen the fugitive Andrew Johnson at the convenience store on the street. Michael didn't wait to hear more and bolted from the store. The doorbell rang violently. The cold night air hit him, but he barely noticed. His mind was focused solely on escaping as fast as possible. As he ran down the dark street, Michael desperately wondered where he could go now, with no money, no ID, and the whole world chasing him. He questioned how he could prove who he really was. The sound of sirens began in the distance, rapidly approaching. Michael ducked into an alley. His heart was pounding so fiercely it felt like it might explode. He knew he couldn't keep running forever. Eventually, he would have to face the truth and find a way to prove his identity. But for now, all he could do was keep running and hope that a solution would present itself before it was too late. Michael raced through the dark streets, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst through his ribcage. The sound of sirens grew closer, echoing through the quiet pre-dawn city. He turned one corner, then another, trying to shake off his pursuers. Suddenly, something caught his eye. It was a large map. Michael came to an abrupt halt in front of the map fixed to a city bus stop. Panting heavily, his eyes darted across the lines and contours of the map. He muttered to himself, "Think, Michael, think." I was grabbed near the newsstand. Where did they take me from there? How long was I in that van? Michael closed his eyes, desperately trying to recall every detail of that terrifying moment. The van, the smell of new leather, the sensation of turning corners, and the time. Yes, the time. He had been unconsciously counting, as he always did. That habit might just save him now. It was about a 30-minute drive before we reached where they held me, he realized. Michael's eyes snapped open, and with a trembling hand, he traced an imaginary circle on the map, calculating in his head the distance the van could have traveled in 30 minutes. His gaze fixed on a particular area. It was a rundown industrial zone on the outskirts of the city. That has to be it. The only place they could have hidden me for so long without raising suspicion, Michael thought. He felt a small spark of hope ignite in his chest. Without wasting another moment, Michael committed the location to memory and started running again. The residential streets gradually gave way to wider roads, and soon the buildings of the dilapidated industrial area came into view. The air grew heavy with the smell of metal and old oil. Michael slowed his pace, his senses on high alert. It's close, it has to be, he felt, but he didn't know what to do next. Even if I find the place, how do I prove my story? Michael muttered, his eyes scanning every shadow and alley. Lord, this isn't a movie set, it's a police precinct, he thought. Michael moved cautiously, taking each step as quietly as possible. The surrounding buildings seemed to watch him with their empty, dark windows, like the eyes of an abandoned city. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant howl of a dog and the sound of metal creaking in the wind. As he turned another corner, Michael felt his heart leap into his throat. There, nestled between dilapidated warehouses, was a black van. It looked identical to the one that had taken him away. Michael quickly ducked behind a rusty container. His heart was pounding so fiercely he feared it might be audible. That's it. That's the van that took me. It has to be, Michael thought, his mind racing through possibilities. But are they still here? Or is this just a cruel coincidence? Summoning his courage, Michael cautiously approached the van. Each step felt like an eternity as he drew closer to the vehicle. Fear and adrenaline coursed through his veins, spreading throughout his body. As he got close enough, a chilling sight met his eyes. Fresh tire tracks in the dust indicated the vehicle had been used recently. Michael was about to investigate further when a sound stopped him dead in his tracks. Voices. Men's voices were approaching. Panic-stricken, Michael hid behind a stack of crates, holding his breath. Two men emerged from a nearby warehouse, talking in low voices. One asked nervously if Andrew was really coming today. The other replied irritably but calmly, saying the boss had confirmed it. He added that everything was ready and they should lay low for now, mentioning that the other one should be caught by now. Michael felt fear and anger boiling in his chest. They were talking about him. These men were responsible for what had happened to him. Michael wanted to confront them immediately, demand the truth and answers. But he knew that would be foolish. So he stayed put, absorbing every word they said, hoping for information that could help prove his story. The first man asked about the doctor while opening the van door. The second man laughed coldly, sending chills down Michael's spine, and said Dr. Brown was in too deep to talk. They just needed to keep an eye on him until Andrew arrived. After the men returned to the warehouse, Michael remained motionless for a while. His brain was desperately processing the information he just heard. Andrew, the man whose face he now wore, was expected to arrive. A crazy, dangerous idea formed in Michael's mind. If he could impersonate Andrew, he might get the answers he needed. It was incredibly risky, but with no other options, he had to try. Michael told himself this was his only chance, that he could do it. He'd negotiated with corporate sharks for years, this was just another bluff. Taking a deep breath to calm himself, Michael steeled his resolve. He emerged from his hiding place and headed towards the warehouse. Each step echoed in his ears, and his heartbeat felt so loud he worried it might be audible from a distance. As Michael reached the warehouse door, he hesitated for a moment but then steeled himself. He reminded himself, from now on, you're Andrew. Cold, calculating, and always in control. Straightening his posture to appear confident, Michael pushed the door open forcefully. He entered the warehouse as if he owned the place. The two men he had seen earlier turned abruptly, surprise evident on their faces. The warehouse was spacious, dimly lit, with boxes and equipment scattered about. Well, Michael said in a self-assured voice, masking his inner anxiety. Looks like you've been waiting for me. Everything ready, I presume? The men exchanged quick glances before the taller one stepped forward. Boss, we didn't expect you so early, he said, flustered. We thought you'd come later, yeah, that's what we figured. Michael nodded dismissively, trying to act like a ruthless criminal. Change of plans, he said. Thought, I'd better come check things out myself, make sure you haven't screwed everything up. The other man approached, visibly nervous. It's all under control, boss, he assured. Everything's taken care of. The other guy should be behind bars by now. No one will believe a word he says. Michael felt anger at these words, but maintained his composure. He walked around the warehouse, pretending to inspect the boxes and equipment. His mind was racing, trying to understand the situation and maintain his false identity. What about Dr. Brown? Michael asked casually, recalling the earlier conversation. The tall man laughed. No worries, boss. He's in as deep as the rest of us. We showed him some family photos, so he'll keep his mouth shut. He knows what's at stake. Michael nodded slowly, committing all the information to memory. Just as he was about to ask another question, one of the men's cell phones rang, shattering the tense atmosphere. The man hurriedly answered the call, his expression turning serious. Boss, he said. The man hung up the phone and turned to Michael. It's about the deal. Everything's set to go down tonight. What do you want us to do? Suddenly, all eyes were on Michael, waiting for his instructions. Feeling the weight of their expectations, Michael knew his next move could make or break his deception. Michael swallowed hard, his mind racing to find the right answer. The deal, huh? Michael replied, carefully choosing his words to buy time. Of course, let's go over the details. I want to make sure there are no slip-ups this time. The men exchanged quick glances again before the taller one grabbed a file from a nearby table and opened it. The file contained maps and documents that Michael couldn't quite make out from a distance. While the men were distracted, Michael continued to think furiously. He discreetly picked up a cell phone that was lying on the table. As the man began to explain the operation details, Michael felt sick to his stomach. He was about to be deeply involved in criminal activity, but with no other options, he had to keep up the charade. Masking his inner fear with confidence, Michael looked at the two men. So, tell me about this deal. Where and when is it going down? The taller man, whom Michael mentally dubbed big guy answered immediately. Pier 17, boss. 3 trucks are bringing in the cargo at midnight. Michael nodded slowly, pretending to consider the information. And how many men do we have on the job? 6, boss. All armed and ready to go, the other man, who seemed nervous, said in a low voice. Michael frowned, feigning dissatisfaction. That's not enough. Double it. I want 12 men. Big guy and the nervous man exchanged surprised looks. But boss, we were hoping to keep this operation small scale. Big guy began. I've changed my mind. Is that a problem? Michael retorted gruffly. The two quickly shook their heads, saying, No, boss. Not at all. As Michael was about to ask another question, the sound of an approaching car echoed, and everyone froze. The nervous man rushed to the window, peering through the dusty curtains. Boss, you gotta see this. There's a guy coming in who looks just like you. It's gotta be that rich guy, Michael. Looks like he's found our hideout and is coming in. What do we do? His voice trembled, and his hand moved towards the gun at his hip. Michael's heart raced as he looked out the window. There, he saw Andrew, the real criminal, with his face. He knew he had to act fast. Stay calm. I'll handle this, Michael commanded. His mind was racing, desperately trying to come up with a plan. As the warehouse door opened and Andrew appeared, everyone fell silent at the sight of 2 identical faces. Andrew looked around, a puzzled expression on his face. When his eyes landed on Michael, a cold smile spread across his face. With a mix of recognition and surprise, Andrew said, Well. Looks like our little experiment worked better than we thought. Michael, you're wearing my face quite well. Michael felt a chill run down his spine but maintained his composure. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm Andrew, and you're clearly an imposter. Andrew laughed, a sound that made the hair on Michael's neck stand up. Still trying to deceive them? Andrew said. My men have done an excellent job with the disguise, but the game is over, Michael retorted. Big guy and the nervous man looked at each other, completely confused. Boss, what's going on here? Big guy asked hesitantly. Andrew turned to the muscular men, his smile unwavering. Let me explain, gentlemen. This man is Michael Williams. Remember that rich guy we made our scapegoat? Seems he's escaped and come here pretending to be me. Michael felt panic rising in his chest, but forced himself to stay calm. Don't believe him. He's trying to confuse you. I'm the real Andrew. The tension in the air was palpable. Big guy and the nervous man seemed utterly bewildered, their eyes darting between Michael and Andrew. This is ridiculous. Michael, the game is over. Did you really think you could fool me? This was my plan, remember? Andrew stepped forward as he spoke. Michael felt he was losing control of the situation and knew he needed to do something, anything to convince the thugs that he was the real Andrew. Do you really believe this imposter? I'm your boss. I've been looking after you guys for years. At that moment, the nervous man pulled out his gun with shaking hands. Hold it. Who's who? Who's the real boss here? He shouted, his voice echoing through the warehouse. The gun wavered in his hand, moving between Michael and Andrew. Time seemed to stand still. Michael could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. He stared at the gun barrel, then at Andrew, who seemed oddly calm in this situation. Hey, you don't think we planned for this? Put the gun down, let's talk like civilized people, Andrew said in a smooth, calm voice. Michael realized his life depended on his next words. He had to think fast, use all his wits to survive this situation. Don't listen to him. I can prove I'm the real Andrew. Ask me anything, something only the real Andrew would know. Michael desperately cried out. The tension in the warehouse was escalating. While Big Guy and the nervous man discussed what question to ask next, Michael pulled out the cell phone from his pocket with trembling fingers. He dialed 911, leaving the call open without speaking, silently praying the police could trace the call. All right, what's the code to the safe in the beach house? The nervous man yelled at Michael. Michael's heart sank. He had no clue about any such code. Well, it's 0614, he said, and a cold, cruel laugh echoed. Come on, boss, don't tell me you forgot something so basic. The next few minutes were a nightmare for Michael. Question after question came, and he couldn't give the right answers. Each mistake felt like it was digging his grave deeper. The looks from Big Guy and the nervous man were growing increasingly skeptical and distrustful. Finally, after a particularly egregious mistake, the nervous man exploded. Enough of this charade. You're not Andrew, you never were. He pointed the gun at Michael's chest. The cold metal gleamed in the dim light of the warehouse. Michael's heart beat irregularly, and he opened his mouth to protest. He was about to cry for help, to do anything to survive, but before he could speak, the warehouse was bathed in red light, and deafening sirens blared. Police. Nobody move. In an instant, the warehouse was invaded by heavily armed officers, and Michael, Andrew, Big Guy, and the nervous man were quickly subdued and handcuffed. In the chaos, Michael saw his chance. Officers, please listen. I'm Michael Williams. This man, Andrew, kidnapped me and surgically altered my face to look like his. I can prove it, he desperately shouted. For a moment, there was a stunned silence. Then, to everyone's surprise, Andrew started laughing. It wasn't a laugh of desperation or madness, but one of pure, cold satisfaction. Ladies and gentlemen, let me say one thing. He's right, Andrew said. Andrew's face twisted into a terrifying grin. I did it. I'm Andrew Johnson. I kidnapped Michael Williams and changed him into me. It was the perfect plan. I turned a rich, powerful man into the most wanted criminal in this country. While he was running around trying to prove his innocence, I could continue my business without suspicion. After all, who would look for me when Andrew Johnson was in custody? It was easy. A cowardly plastic surgeon, loyal mobsters, and we achieved this. We made Michael Williams face mine. We sent enemies after him and even tipped off the police. If enemies caught him, I'd be presumed dead, and if the police caught him, he'd be in jail instead of me. The plan was to leave him in prison for life, paying for my crimes, but it seems I underestimated our dear Michael's determination. He escaped and even managed to find me. I have to admit, it's impressive. But in the end, it doesn't matter. Because now, even knowing the truth, they can't undo what's been done. Michael Williams will forever have my face. He'll always bear the mark of what I did to him. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is my true victory. The silence following Andrew's confession was heavy, filled with shock and disbelief. Michael felt a mix of relief and deep exhaustion. The truth had finally come to light.
I remember those days after Michael's story hit the headlines like it was yesterday. The relief we felt when the DNA test confirmed his identity was indescribable. It was as if a heavy fog had finally lifted, revealing the truth we'd been desperately searching for. When the dust settled, Michael wasted no time in addressing his situation. I can still hear his voice, filled with determination, as he took my hand and told me he wanted to reclaim his face. My heart swelled with love and admiration for his courage. I knew it would be a difficult process, but I promised to be by his side every step of the way. The guilt I felt for not recognizing him earlier gnawed at me, but Michael's forgiveness was a balm to my soul. I told him I loved him and apologized for my confusion and fear during his disappearance. The words, "I never want to lose you again," tumbled from my lips, carrying the weight of all we'd been through. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of consultations with top surgeons. I watched Michael face each challenge with unwavering resolve, his strength a beacon of hope in our tumultuous journey. Months passed, and slowly but surely, the face in the mirror began to resemble the man I'd always known. My love and support never wavered, a constant presence through the ups and downs of his recovery. In a moment of clarity, we realized our traumatic experience could be transformed into something positive. We established a foundation to support other crime victims, especially those needing reconstructive surgery. The day Michael fully recovered was nothing short of miraculous. I saw not just his original face in the mirror, but also the strength and resilience forged by his ordeal. "Welcome back," I whispered, embracing him from behind, my heart overflowing with joy. His smile, so familiar yet somehow new, reflected back at me as he echoed my words. 6 months after Michael regained his appearance, our life found a new rhythm. That Saturday morning began like many recent ones, with Michael rising early to brew coffee. I was still in bed when he brought me a cup, his whispered, "Good morning, love," as warm as the beverage he set on the nightstand. As I opened my eyes, a smile playing on my lips, I asked if he was ready for the big day. I could sense his mix of nervousness and excitement. Today is the official opening of the Williams Crime Victim Support Fund, a project that had consumed much of his time and resources over the past months. After breakfast, we headed downtown where a small building had been renovated to house the foundation. A modest crowd had already gathered, journalists, local politicians, and most importantly, people the fund had already started helping. As Michael adjusted his tie and took a deep breath before approaching the podium at the entrance, I felt a surge of pride. The camera flashes began, and I watched him prepare to speak, knowing that our journey had led us to this moment of purpose and healing. I stood there, my heart swelling with pride as Michael began his speech with a strong, clear voice. He greeted everyone, and I could feel the weight of the past year in his words. As he spoke about the unimaginable trials he'd faced, questioning his very identity and place in the world, I felt a lump form in my throat. His eyes met mine for a brief moment, and I smiled encouragingly, hoping to convey all my love and support in that single glance. Michael went on to explain how this foundation was born from his ordeal, and I marveled at how we managed to turn such a horrific experience into something positive. His words about helping crime victims rebuild their lives, both emotionally and physically, resonated deeply with me. When he invited Catherine, one of the fund's first beneficiaries, to the stage, I felt a surge of emotion. Here was living proof of the good we could do, a woman who'd suffered a violent attack but was now on the path to recovery thanks to our support. After the speech, Michael and I spent hours talking with attendees, sharing our story and listening to theirs. Each conversation reinforced why we were doing this, why it mattered so much. As the last guest left, we found ourselves alone in the main office of the foundation. I noticed Michael's distant gaze and asked if he was okay, concern coloring my voice. His smile as he pulled me close melted away my worries. He told me he felt good, truly good, for the first time in a long while. He felt he was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he needed to do. I kissed him gently, overwhelmed with pride and love. I told him how proud I was, how he turned something terrible into something wonderful. As we stood there, watching the sunset through the office window, I could sense Michael reflecting on our journey. I knew the emotional scars were still there, but they'd become a reminder of the strength he'd found within himself, rather than traumatic memories. When he spoke about truly being oneself, about how it's not about the face in the mirror, but the decisions we make and the impact we have on others' lives, I felt my love for him deepen even further. I squeezed his hand tightly, telling him that's why I loved him, Michael Williams. As we left the office, I felt ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring. We'd found a greater purpose through our trials, and together, I knew we could overcome anything.
If you enjoyed this tale, we encourage you to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. Your support is what drives us to bring you exciting stories every day. Don't miss the next incredible story that will appear on your screen. We truly appreciate you being here with us. You can click the link appearing on your screen now. We have a special selection waiting for you, filled with worthwhile stories and guaranteed entertainment. We'll see you there.